In the quaint village of St. Mary Mead, a priceless 17th-century family portrait vanishes from Ashford Manor during a bustling estate sale, sparking whispers of a hidden treasure map. Miss Jane Marple, with her sharp wit and quiet knitting, unravels a web of secrets among suspects. A nervous auctioneer with a shady deal, a wealthy widow craving the painting, a brooding heir hiding his grief, and a mysterious guest sketching clues. As clues like a blue thread and gold flecks lead to a hidden passage, Miss Marple uncovers the truth, love, greed, and a portrait's legacy in a thrilling whodunit. Chapter 1. The Vanishing Heirloom. The late summer sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of Ashford Manor, a Georgian pile nestled in the heart of St. Mary Mead. The village, with its sleepy charm, had stirred into uncharacteristic bustle for the estate sale of Sir Henry Ashford, whose recent passing had left the manor's treasures up for grabs. Villagers and strangers alike thronged the gravel drive, their voices a low hum of anticipation, drawn by whispers of rare antiques and the promise of a bargain. At the edge of the grand hall, seated in a faded velvet armchair, Miss Jane Marple surveyed the scene, her knitting needles moving with the quiet rhythm of a metronome. Her sharp eyes, framed by delicate spectacles, missed nothing, not the eager glint in a bidder's gaze, nor the subtle fidget of a nervous hand. The hall itself was a study in faded grandeur, high ceilings adorned with cracked plasterwork, tall windows admitting slants of dusty light, and walls lined with portraits of Ashford's long gone. At the center of the room, on a sturdy oak easel, stood the sale's crown jewel, a 17th-century family portrait, its heavy gilt frame gleaming under the chandelier. The canvas depicted 3 generations of Ashfords, their stern faces rendered in rich oils, the patriarch's hand resting on a globe that hinted at some forgotten ambition. Village gossip, ever reliable, claimed the painting concealed a secret. A map, perhaps, to a hidden fortune buried in the manor's grounds. Miss Marple, who took such tales with a grain of salt, noted the portrait's commanding presence and the way it drew every eye. Mr. Reginald Thorne, the auctioneer, strutted before the crowd like a peacock, his voice booming with practiced charm. "A masterpiece, ladies and gentlemen," he declared, gesturing to the portrait. "A window into the Ashford legacy. Shall we start the bidding at £500? His wiry frame, clad in a slightly too tight suit, quivered with enthusiasm, though Miss Marple observed the way he tugged at his cufflinks when no one immediately bid. The crowd murmured, hesitant, as if the painting's weighty history intimidated them. She jotted a mental note. Mr. Thorne's theatrics seemed a touch too polished, his smile a fraction too fixed. Among the onlookers, Mrs. Clara Winthrop, a widow of considerable means, stood out in her emerald silk dress, her fingers heavy with diamonds. She gazed at the portrait with a proprietary air, whispering to her maid, Elsie, who hovered at her elbow like a shadow. Miss Marple, sipping tea from a chipped porcelain cup, overheard Mrs. Winthrop murmur, "It would be perfect for the gallery at Winthrop Lodge." Her ambition was palpable, but so was her impatience when a villager outbid her on a silver candelabra moments later. Nearby, Edward Ashford, Sir Henry's nephew and sole heir, lingered by a window, his handsome face clouded with displeasure. His dark coat was impeccably tailored, but a smudge of dirt on his cuff suggested a recent foray into the manor's gardens. He had opposed the sale, Miss Marple knew, having heard him argue with the estate's solicitor in the village post office days prior. "The portrait belongs here," he'd said, his voice low but fierce. Now he avoided the easel, his gaze fixed on the horizon, as if the manor's emptying pained him. A stranger, Mr. Lionel Gray, caught Miss Marple's attention as he drifted through the crowd. His tweed jacket was shabby, his notebook filled with hurried sketches of the portrait's frame. "Just an art enthusiast," he said when a footman questioned him, but his sharp eyes darted too often toward the room's exits. Miss Marple, who had a knack for spotting the out-of-place, wondered what brought him to St. Mary Mead. At precisely 11:30, a commotion broke the auction's rhythm. A glass of sherry, knocked from a table by a clumsy bidder, shattered on the parquet floor. Mr. Thorne rushed to manage the mess, his cufflinks glinting as he waved for a servant. The crowd's attention shifted, and for a brief moment the portrait stood unwatched. When Thorne returned to his podium, his face blanched. "The portrait!" he gasped. "It's gone." A collective gasp rose, followed by a flurry of whispers. The easel stood empty, its velvet drape crumpled on the floor. Constable Slack, summoned from the village, arrived with his usual bluster, demanding statements. Miss Marple, her knitting paused, watched the suspects' faces. Thorne's shock, Mrs. Winthrop's indignation, Edward's grim silence, Gray's sudden absence, and felt the familiar stir of curiosity. A theft in broad daylight in a room full of people was no small feat. She adjusted her shawl and resolved to unravel the mystery. Chapter 2. The Auctioneer's Tale. The grand hall of Ashford Manor, still buzzing with the shock of the stolen portrait, seemed to close in around its occupants as the afternoon light faded into a soft, golden haze. The crowd, once eager for bargains, now whispered in tight clusters, their eyes darting toward the empty easel where the Ashford family portrait had stood mere hours before. Miss Jane Marple, seated unobtrusively near a tarnished bronze urn, her knitting needles clicking with their usual steady cadence, observed the scene with the quiet intensity of a hawk. Her frail appearance, with her white hair neatly pinned and her shawl draped just so, belied the sharpness of her mind, which was already sifting through the morning's events like a prospector panning for gold. Constable Slack, a man whose enthusiasm for his duties often outstripped his subtlety, had taken charge with predictable vigor. His broad shoulders filled the doorway as he barked orders to a nervous footman, demanding a list of every soul present at the estate sale. "A theft like this, in broad daylight," he exclaimed, mopping his brow with a handkerchief. "We'll have the culprit by supper, mark my words." Miss Marple, sipping a lukewarm cup of tea provided by the manor's housekeeper, Mrs. Bates, permitted herself a small, private smile. Constable Slack's confidence, she knew from past encounters, was as reliable as a paper umbrella in a storm. Her attention, however, was fixed on Mr. Reginald Thorne, the auctioneer who stood near the podium, his wiry frame taut with agitation. His suit, a shade too tight and a touch too shiny, strained at the shoulders as he gestured animatedly to a pair of villagers. "I tell you, it was there one moment, gone the next," he insisted, his voice carrying a theatrical quaver that drew curious glances. His hands, never still, tugged repeatedly at his cufflinks, silver, engraved with a curious spiral design that caught the light. Miss Marple noted this habit, filing it away alongside the faint sheen of perspiration on his forehead and the way his eyes avoided meeting hers when she offered a polite nod. Mr. Thorne's role in the sale had been central, and thus his account was critical. Miss Marple, with her knack for coaxing confidences, approached him as the crowd thinned, her manner as gentle as a summer breeze. "A dreadful business, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice soft but clear. "You must be quite shaken. Perhaps you could tell me exactly what happened. My nephew, Raymond, always says a clear account sets the mind at ease." Thorne, momentarily disarmed by her kindly demeanor, hesitated, then launched into his tale. "It was just past 11, Miss Marple," he began, adjusting his cufflinks with a twitch. "The portrait was the highlight of the sale, you see, a genuine Van Dyck, or so Sir Henry claimed, though I've my doubts about the attribution. Still, it was magnificent. 3 generations of Ashfords, painted with such vigor. I just called for bids when that clumsy oaf, pardon me, a gentleman, knocked over a glass of sherry. The mess was dreadful, and I had to step away to fetch a servant. I wasn't gone 3 minutes, I swear it. When I returned, the easel was empty, the velvet drape on the floor. Stolen, right under our noses." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, her needles pausing as she considered his words. "3 minutes is a short time, Mr. Thorne," she remarked, "and the hall was so crowded. Surely someone would have noticed a large canvas being spirited away?" Thorne's eyes widened, and he tugged at his cufflinks again, the gesture almost a reflex. "That's just it, madam. It's impossible. Yet it happened. The portrait's frame alone is 4 feet tall, heavy as sin. No one could have carried it out without being seen. I checked the ledger myself. No bids were recorded for it, and I'd not removed it from the easel. I'm at a loss, truly." His distress seemed genuine, but Miss Marple's experience with human nature, gleaned from years of observing St. Mary Mead's petty dramas, warned her against taking appearances at face value. She recalled a village grocer who'd wept convincingly over a stolen sack of flour, only to be found selling it out his back door. "Your ledger," she said thoughtfully, "might it show who was near the portrait before the sherry incident?" Thorne blinked as if the question surprised him. "Well, I suppose, but it only lists items and bids, not people milling about. I was busy with the candelabra lot when the glass broke. Mrs. Winthrop was bidding fiercely, I recall, her and that young Ashford fellow, Edward, though he was sulking by the window, not bidding. And there was that odd chap, Gray, scribbling in his notebook. But I didn't see anyone touch the portrait." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, though her smile remained serene. "And the sherry spill, Mr. Thorne, did you see who caused it?" "A gentleman, as I said," Thorne replied quickly, then faltered. "I didn't catch his name. One of the villagers, I think. He apologized profusely and slipped away before I could ask more. The servant, Tom, cleaned it up quick enough." Miss Marple made a mental note to speak with Tom, the footman, whose lanky frame she'd seen darting about with a mop. She also noted Thorne's reluctance to name the clumsy bidder, a detail that might mean nothing or everything. "You've a difficult task, managing such a sale," she said, her tone soothing. "I imagine you've handled many valuable items. Have you ever encountered a theft before?" Thorne's face reddened, and he tugged at his cufflinks so sharply one nearly popped off. "Never, Miss Marple. My reputation is spotless. I've conducted sales from London to Bath, and not a single item's gone missing on my watch. This is a calamity, a blot on my name." His voice rose, drawing glances from nearby villagers, and he lowered it with effort. "I've sent for my assistant to double-check the inventory, but I fear the portrait's gone for good." Miss Marple murmured her sympathies, her mind racing. Thorne's indignation was plausible, but his nervous gestures suggested more than professional embarrassment. She recalled a tidbit from Mrs. Bantry, her friend at Gossington Hall, who'd mentioned Thorne's reputation for driving hard bargains, perhaps too hard. Could he have orchestrated the theft to inflate the portrait's value or divert suspicion? Or was he, as he claimed, merely a victim of circumstance? As Thorne excused himself to confer with Constable Slack, Miss Marple turned her attention to the sale room itself. The oak-paneled walls, darkened by age, loomed over the scattered furniture and curios. The easel, now bare, stood like a silent witness, its velvet drape neatly folded by some thoughtful hand. Likely Mrs. Bates, the housekeeper, whose devotion to the manor was legendary. Miss Marple approached the easel, her eyes scanning the floor. A faint scuff mark, barely noticeable, marred the parquet near the base, as if something heavy had been dragged. She crouched, her joints protesting, and peered closer. A tiny fleck of gold paint, no larger than a pinhead, glinted in the dust. The portrait's frame, she recalled, was gilded. Curious. Rising, she glanced at the wall behind the easel, where a tapestry hung slightly askew. Her fingers, nimble despite her age, brushed the fabric, revealing a hairline crack in the paneling. A concealed door, perhaps, though it didn't budge when she pressed. Such passages were common in old manors, she knew, used by servants or, in times past, for less savory purposes. She made a note to ask Mrs. Bates about it discreetly. The crowd had dwindled, leaving only a few stragglers, and the suspects Thorne had mentioned. Mrs. Clara Winthrop, resplendent in her emerald dress, was deep in conversation with a local antiques dealer, her laughter bright but calculated. Edward Ashford, the heir, had retreated to a corner, his expression as stormy as ever, a gardening book clutched in his hand as if to justify his earlier absence. Mr. Lionel Gray, the mysterious guest, had vanished entirely, though Miss Marple spotted his notebook, forgotten on a side table, its pages filled with sketches of the portrait's frame and cryptic notes about provenance. She slipped it into her handbag for later perusal, reasoning that Mr. Gray would return for it. Constable Slack, meanwhile, was interrogating Tom, the footman, whose freckled face flushed under the scrutiny. "I was in the pantry when the sherry spilled, sir," Tom stammered. "I only came when Mr. Thorne called me. Didn't see no one near the portrait, I swear." Slack, unimpressed, scribbled in his notebook, muttering about slippery villagers. Miss Marple, however, caught Tom's glance toward the tapestry, brief but telling. Did he know of the hidden panel, or was he merely nervous? As the hall emptied, Miss Marple lingered, her knitting resumed but her thoughts elsewhere. Thorne's story, though dramatic, held gaps. His distraction by the sherry spill was convenient, and his ledger, which she'd glimpsed on the podium, listed the portrait but no bids, a detail that nagged at her. Why had no one bid on so fine a piece? And the scuff mark, the gold fleck, did they point to a hasty theft or something more deliberate? She recalled a similar case in St. Mary Mead, when a silver teapot vanished during a church bazaar, only to be found in the vicar's wife's attic, hidden by her son to prevent its sale. Sentiment, greed, or pride, motives as old as time. Mrs. Bates, the housekeeper, approached with a fresh pot of tea, her lined face etched with worry. "A sad day for the manor, Miss Marple," she said, setting the pot down. "That portrait was Sir Henry's pride. He'd turn in his grave to know it's gone." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, her tone gentle but probing. "It's a curious thing, Mrs. Bates, a painting so large, taken in such a crowd. Have you noticed anything odd today? Anyone near the easel, perhaps?" Mrs. Bates hesitated, her hands smoothing her apron. "Well, I shouldn't say, but that Mr. Gray was poking about earlier, asking about the portrait's history. And young Mr. Edward, he was in and out of the hall, though he said he was tending the roses. I did see him near the easel once, but he didn't touch it." Miss Marple nodded, storing this away. Edward's presence near the easel, Thorne's nervous tics, Gray's sketches, and the hidden panel, all pieces of a puzzle yet to form a picture. She thanked Mrs. Bates and returned to her knitting, her mind weaving a different kind of pattern. The auctioneer's tale was only the beginning, and Miss Marple, with her unerring instinct for truth, knew the real story lay hidden in the shadows of Ashford Manor. Chapter 3. The Buyer's Motive. The afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows of Ashford Manor's drawing room, casting a warm glow on the polished mahogany table where Miss Jane Marple sat, her knitting a soft counterpoint to the murmurs of the lingering crowd. The theft of the family portrait had left the estate sale in disarray, with villagers and visitors alike speculating in hushed tones. Constable Slack, his notebook now bulging with hasty scribbles, had retreated to question the servants, leaving the drawing room a quieter space for Miss Marple's unobtrusive inquiries. Her eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, settled on Mrs. Clara Winthrop, the wealthy widow whose interest in the portrait had been as conspicuous as her emerald silk dress. Mrs. Winthrop stood by a marble fireplace, her posture regal, her diamond rings catching the light as she gestured to a companion, a dour-faced antiques dealer who nodded at her every word. Her maid, Elsie, hovered nearby, a slight figure in a starched black uniform, her eyes darting nervously about the room. Miss Marple, who had a knack for reading the undercurrents of human behavior, noted Elsie's unease and filed it away. Mrs. Winthrop's reputation preceded her, a collector of rare art. Her Winthrop Lodge was said to house a gallery that rivaled any in the county. The portrait, with its rumored secret, would have been a prize for such a woman. Miss Marple rose, her shawl adjusted with care, and approached Mrs. Winthrop with the diffidence of a village spinster. "Mrs. Winthrop," she said, her voice gentle as a summer breeze. "I couldn't help overhearing your admiration for the Ashford portrait earlier. Such a pity it's gone missing. You must be terribly disappointed." Mrs. Winthrop turned, her smile polished but guarded. "Oh, Miss Marple, isn't it dreadful? That painting was a masterpiece. Van Dyck or not, it had a certain gravitas. I'd have paid a fortune for it, you know. It would have been the centerpiece of my collection." Her voice carried a note of regret, but her eyes were cool, assessing. "I suppose someone else coveted it just as much, though their methods were less honest." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, her needles clicking softly, as she resumed her seat nearby, inviting Mrs. Winthrop to join her. "It's curious, isn't it? A painting so large, taken in such a crowded room. You were bidding on other items, I believe, when the theft occurred." Mrs. Winthrop settled into a chair, her silk skirt rustling. "Yes, I was quite caught up with a silver candelabra, 17th century, exquisite work. I won it, thankfully, though it cost me dearly. 2 gentlemen from the village were bidding against me, you see, and I was with them when the sherry glass broke. I heard Mr. Thorne's outcry about the portrait moments later. I couldn't have been near the easel, I'm afraid." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of mild interest, though her mind was sharp as a tack. "How fortunate you have such a clear alibi. And your maid, Elsie, she was with you, I presume?" Mrs. Winthrop's smile tightened, almost imperceptibly. "Elsie? Oh, she was fetching my shawl from the cloakroom, I believe. The hall was so drafty. But she's a good girl, always close by when I need her." She waved a hand, dismissing the topic, but Miss Marple caught Elsie's quick glance toward her mistress, a flicker of something, fear, perhaps, or caution. The conversation turned to lighter matters. Mrs. Winthrop's collection, the charm of St. Mary Mead, but Miss Marple's thoughts were elsewhere. Mrs. Winthrop's alibi was solid, corroborated by the two villagers, whom Miss Marple knew as honest if overly fond of gossip. Yet the widow's keen interest in the portrait, coupled with Elsie's nervous demeanor, suggested more than a passing fancy. Could Mrs. Winthrop have orchestrated the theft, using her maid as a proxy? Or was her ambition merely that of a collector thwarted? As Mrs. Winthrop excused herself to inspect a set of porcelain figurines, Miss Marple beckoned Elsie over under the pretense of asking for more tea. The maid approached, her hands twisting in her apron. "Elsie, dear," Miss Marple said kindly, "it must be quite a day for you, with all this excitement. Did you see anything unusual near the portrait before it vanished?" Elsie's cheeks flushed, and she glanced toward the door where Mrs. Winthrop had gone. "No, miss," she said quickly. "I was in the cloakroom, like the mistress said. I didn't see nothing near the easel. It was all so busy with folks coming and going." Her words tumbled out too fast, and Miss Marple noted the way her eyes avoided contact, settling instead on the floor. "Of course," Miss Marple said, her tone soothing. "It's easy to miss things in such a crowd, though I did notice young Mr. Ashford near the easel earlier. Did you happen to see him there?" Elsie hesitated, then shook her head. I don't recall, miss. I was fetching the shawl, like I said." But her fingers tightened on her apron, and Miss Marple, who had seen similar signs in the vicar's wife when questioned about a missing collection plate, knew Elsie was holding something back. As Elsie hurried away to fetch the tea, Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the drawing-room's windows, where the gardens stretched toward the horizon. Edward Ashford had claimed to be cataloging plants during the theft, yet Mrs. Bates had seen him near the easel earlier, and Elsie's reluctance to speak suggested she knew more than she admitted, perhaps something overheard or seen in her duties for Mrs. Winthrop. Miss Marple recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a maid's loyalty to her employer had concealed a theft of silver spoons, only revealed when the maid's nerves betrayed her. Loyalty, she mused, could be as much a motive as greed. The drawing-room began to empty as the sale wound down, the remaining items, lesser paintings, chipped vases, drawing little interest. Miss Marple, however, lingered, her knitting a pretext for observation. She noticed a small detail on the table where Mrs. Winthrop had sat, a folded catalog from the sale, its corner marked with a pencil sketch of the portrait's frame, remarkably similar to those in Mr. Gray's notebook. Had Mrs. Winthrop been studying the painting's details, or was the sketch mere coincidence? Miss Marple slipped the catalog into her handbag alongside Gray's notebook, resolving to compare them later. Constable Slack reappeared, his face red with frustration. "No one saw a thing, Miss Marple," he grumbled, pausing near her chair. "That painting's vanished into thin air, and I've half a mind to search every house in the village. What do you make of it?" Miss Marple smiled faintly, her needles never pausing. "Oh, I'm sure it's not gone far, Constable. People are rarely as clever as they think, you know. A painting like that, it's too large to hide easily. Perhaps we should consider why someone wanted it so badly." Slack snorted, unconvinced, and strode off to harangue the footman again. Miss Marple, however, turned her thoughts to Mrs. Winthrop's motives. The widow's wealth and status made outright theft unlikely. Why risk her reputation? Yet the portrait's rumored secret, the map to a hidden fortune, might tempt even a woman of means. Or perhaps her interest was purely aesthetic, and Elsie's nerves were due to some unrelated matter, a personal worry, or a secret of her own. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the room, Miss Marple rose, her steps slow but purposeful. She would speak with Mrs. Bates about the manor's history, and perhaps with Edward Ashford, whose resentment of the sale was as clear as day. Mrs. Winthrop's alibi might be airtight, but alibis, Miss Marple knew, could be constructed as carefully as a house of cards. And Elsie's hesitation was a crack in that structure, one she intended to explore. With a final glance at the empty easel, now a silent testament to the day's mystery, Miss Marple stepped into the fading light, her mind already weaving the threads of suspicion into a pattern only she could see. Chapter 4. The Heir's Burden. The late afternoon light draped Ashford Manor in a soft amber glow, its long shadows stretching across the rose garden where Miss Jane Marple found herself strolling, her knitting bag tucked under her arm. The estate sale had wound down to a murmur, with only a few stragglers inspecting the remaining lots. A chipped porcelain shepherdess, a tarnished brass lamp. The theft of the family portrait, however, hung over the manor like a storm cloud, its absence felt in every whispered conversation. Miss Marple, with her unassuming air and keen eye, had chosen the garden as her next vantage point, for it was here that Edward Ashford, Sir Henry's nephew and heir, claimed to have spent the crucial moments when the portrait vanished. Edward stood alone by a bed of crimson roses, his tall frame slightly stooped as he examined a leaf with undue intensity. His dark coat, though well cut, bore faint traces of earth on the cuffs, and his face, handsome but drawn, carried the weight of unspoken grievances. Miss Marple, who had observed many a young man in St. Mary Mead wrestling with their duties, recognized the signs of a soul at odds with itself. She approached with her usual diffidence, her steps light on the gravel path. "Mr. Ashford," she said, her voice as gentle as the breeze rustling the roses. "What a splendid garden. I understand you've been tending it today. It must be a comfort, with all this upheaval in the manor." Edward started, his hand dropping the leaf as if caught in some guilty act. "Miss Marple," he replied, his tone polite but guarded. "Yes, the roses were my uncle's pride. I've been cataloging the hybrids. His notes were incomplete, you see." He gestured vaguely to a leather-bound notebook tucked under his arm, its pages dog-eared and smudged with soil. "How diligent of you," Miss Marple said, settling onto a nearby bench and retrieving her knitting. "It's rare for a young man to take such an interest in botany, especially on a day like this. You weren't at the sale when the portrait went missing, I gather?" Edward's jaw tightened, and he turned his gaze to the horizon, where the manor's chimneys pierced the sky. "No, I wasn't. I told Constable Slack I was here, in the garden, all morning. The sale, it's not to my taste. Selling off the family's history like so much clutter. It's wrong." His voice, low and fervent, carried a bitterness that Miss Marple noted with interest. She nodded sympathetically, her needles clicking softly. "I quite understand. That portrait in particular, it must hold great meaning for you. I heard it depicts your ancestors, including your late mother, perhaps." Edward's eyes flickered, a shadow passing over his face. "Yes, my mother was in it. Margaret Ashford. She died when I was a boy. The painting's one of the few things left of her. To see it auctioned off to some stranger." He trailed off, his fingers clenching around the notebook. "I tried to convince the solicitor to keep it, but the estate's debts, they said, left no choice." Miss Marple's expression remained serene, but her mind was alert, sifting through his words. The smudge of oil paint she'd noticed on his cuff during their earlier encounter in the hall nagged at her, a curious detail for a man who claimed to have avoided the sale room. "It's a heavy burden, being the last of the Ashfords," she said gently. "I imagine you felt a duty to protect her memory. Were you in the garden the entire time the sale was happening?" Edward hesitated, his gaze dropping to the roses. "Yes, from 10 until well past noon. I didn't go near the hall until after the theft was discovered. Ask Mrs. Bates. She saw me out here, pruning." His tone was firm, but Miss Marple caught a slight tremor in his hand, the notebook quivering as he adjusted his grip. "Mrs. Bates is a treasure," Miss Marple agreed, her needles pausing as she met his eyes. "Though she did mention seeing you near the easel earlier in the morning, before the sherry incident. Perhaps you were admiring the portrait one last time." Edward's face flushed, and he took a step back, as if the question had struck a nerve. "She's mistaken," he said quickly. "I was in the garden, as I said. The hall was too crowded for my liking. I only went in later, when I heard the commotion." His eyes darted to the manor, then back to Miss Marple, and she noted the faintest sheen of perspiration on his brow, despite the cool air. "Of course," Miss Marple said, her tone soothing. "Memory can be tricky in such a bustle. Though it's odd, isn't it? A painting so large, taken in broad daylight. One wonders how it could be moved without notice. Have you any thoughts on that, Mr. Ashford?" He shook his head, his expression closing like a shuttered window. "None. It's a mystery to me. I only hope it's found before some collector carts it off to London or worse." He excused himself abruptly, claiming a need to check the greenhouse, and strode away, his steps a touch too brisk. Miss Marple watched him go. Her knitting resumed, but her thoughts racing. Edward's defensiveness, coupled with the paint smudge and Mrs. Bates's observation, painted a picture of a young man deeply attached to the portrait, perhaps too attached. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a young farmer had hidden his mother's heirloom brooch to prevent its sale, driven by sentiment rather than greed. Could Edward have acted similarly, spiriting the portrait away to preserve his mother's memory? The garden, with its secluded paths and proximity to the manor's rear entrance, offered ample opportunity for such a deed. She rose and wandered toward the greenhouse, her steps leisurely but purposeful. The glass structure, streaked with moss, housed rows of exotic plants, their leaves glistening in the fading light. Inside, she found no sign of Edward, but a small side door, half hidden by ivy, caught her eye. It led to a narrow path that circled back to the manor's west wing, near the sale room. The path was overgrown, but recent footprints marked the earth, large like a man's, and fresh. Miss Marple knelt, her joints protesting, and examined a faint trace of gold fleck in the soil, similar to the one she'd found near the easel. The portrait's frame, she recalled, was heavily gilded. Returning to the garden, she spotted Mrs. Bates emerging from the manor with a tray of empty teacups. "Mrs. Bates," Miss Marple called, her voice warm. "You've been so kind today. I was just speaking with Mr. Ashford about his roses. He mentioned you saw him in the garden this morning. Can you recall when that was?" Mrs. Bates, her face lined with years of service, frowned slightly. "Well, Miss Marple, I did see him out here, pruning, around 10, I think. But I also saw him in the hall earlier, near the portrait, before the sale got busy. He was looking at it all sorrowful-like. I didn't think much of it at the time. He's always been fond of that painting." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of mild curiosity. "And after the sherry spill, when the portrait went missing, did you see him then?" Mrs. Bates shook her head. "No, miss. I was in the kitchen, helping with the tea. By the time I heard about the theft, Mr. Edward was back in the garden, or so he said." Her tone held a hint of doubt, and Miss Marple, who knew the loyalty of old retainers, sensed Mrs. Bates's reluctance to speak ill of the Ashford heir. Thanking her, Miss Marple returned to the bench, her knitting a pretext for reflection. Edward's alibi, like Mrs. Winthrop's, was plausible, but not airtight. The path from the greenhouse to the manor suggested a route by which the portrait could have been moved, perhaps to a hiding place within the sprawling estate. The gold fleck on the path, so like the one in the hall, hinted at a connection, though whether it implicated Edward or another remained unclear. His attachment to the portrait, rooted in his mother's memory, was a powerful motive, but Miss Marple knew better than to leap to conclusions. Sentiment could mask other intentions, greed, perhaps, if the rumored map was real. As the garden darkened, the manor's lights began to glow, casting a warm halo over the roses. Miss Marple tucked her knitting away, her mind weaving a tapestry of possibilities. Edward's burden as the heir, his resentment of the sale, and his presence near the easel formed a troubling pattern. But patterns, she knew, could deceive. She would need to speak with Mr. Gray, whose sketches and sudden absence were equally puzzling, and revisit the sale room for further clues. For now, the heir's story held her attention, its threads of duty and loss tugging at the edges of the mystery. Chapter 5. The Guest's Curiosity. The twilight air hung heavy over Ashford Manor as Miss Jane Marple made her way back from the rose garden, her sensible shoes crunching softly on the gravel path. The estate sale had all but dissolved, leaving behind a scattering of empty chairs and half-forgotten catalogues in the grand hall. The theft of the family portrait remained the talk of Saint. Mary Mead, with villagers lingering in knots outside the manor's gates, their voices a low hum of speculation. Miss Marple, her knitting bag swinging gently at her side, felt the weight of the mystery settle into her bones. Her thoughts turned to Mr. Lionel Gray, the enigmatic stranger whose presence at the sale had been as fleeting as it was curious. Mr. Gray had slipped away shortly after the portrait's disappearance, leaving behind only his notebook, which now rested in Miss Marple's handbag, alongside Mrs. Winthrop's marked catalogue. His absence was conspicuous, and his earlier behavior, scribbling sketches of the portrait's frame and asking pointed questions about its provenance, had caught the attention of more than just Miss Marple. She recalled the housekeeper, Mrs. Bates, mentioning his odd inquiries about the manor's history, and the footman, Tom, had noted Gray's habit of lingering near the sale room's exits. To Miss Marple, whose experience with St. Mary Mead's occasional interlopers had honed her instincts, Mr. Gray was a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. She settled into a cushioned chair in the Manor's library, a quiet haven lined with leather-bound volumes and heavy drapes that muffled the evening's chill. The room smelled of old paper and polish, and a single lamp cast a warm circle of light over the table where she placed her handbag. Opening Mr. Gray's notebook, she examined its pages with care. The sketches were meticulous, detailed renderings of the portrait's gilt frame, with annotations about its carvings, intricate vines, and what appeared to be a tiny, hidden clasp. Beside one sketch, Gray had scrawled, "Ashford crest. Verify provenance." Another page noted the painting's dimensions and a cryptic reference to 17th century ciphers. Miss Marple's brow furrowed slightly. Was Gray an art historian, as he claimed, or something more? Her musings were interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Bates, bearing a tray with a teapot and a plate of scones. "Thought you might need a bit of warmth, Miss Marple," the housekeeper said, her voice kind but tinged with weariness. "It's been a trying day, with all this talk of theft." "You're too good, Mrs. Bates," Miss Marple replied, her smile warm. "I was just thinking about that Mr. Gray. He seemed awfully interested in the portrait, didn't he? Do you know if he's staying in the village?" Mrs. Bates set the tray down, her hands lingering on the teapot. "He's at the Blue Boar, I heard, though he's not one for chit-chat. Came to the manor a few days ago, asking about old Sir Henry's collection. Said he was writing a book on country estates, but he spent more time sketching than talking. I saw him in the hall this morning, near the portrait, before the sherry spill. He was scribbling away, then left quick as you like when the commotion started." Miss Marple poured herself a cup of tea, her movements deliberate. "Did he speak to anyone else? Mr. Thorne, perhaps, or young Mr. Ashford?" "Not that I saw," Mrs. Bates said, frowning. "Though he did ask Tom, the footman, about the manor's old passages. Said it was for his book, something about hidden rooms in grand houses. Tom thought it odd, but he's a polite lad, answered what he could." This piqued Miss Marple's interest. The concealed panel she'd noticed behind the easel, with its disturbed dust and faint scent of linseed oil, suggested a passage that could have been used to spirit the portrait away. If Gray had been inquiring about such routes, his curiosity took on a new significance. She thanked Mrs. Bates, who bustled off to tend to the remaining guests, and turned her attention back to the notebook. A final page caught her eye. A rough map of the manor's ground floor, with an arrow pointing to the sale room and a question mark beside the word attic. Miss Marple's fingers paused on the page. An attic would be a logical hiding place for a large painting, but accessing it undetected in a crowded manor was another matter. Determined to learn more, Miss Marple ventured into the village, her shawl drawn tight against the evening breeze. The Blue Boar, a cozy inn with ivy-clad walls, was a short walk from the manor. The landlord, Mr. Higgins, greeted her with a nod, accustomed to her occasional visits when village mysteries required her attention. "Evening, Miss Marple," he said, polishing a glass behind the bar. "Come about that Gray fellow, I reckon? He's in the parlor, but he's not one for company. Keeps to himself, always scribbling." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling. "Just a word, Mr. Higgins. I found a notebook he left at the manor, and I thought he might want it back." She patted her handbag. her excuse as plausible as it was strategic. In the parlor, a small room warmed by a crackling fire, Mr. Gray sat alone at a corner table, his tweed jacket rumpled and his pen moving swiftly over a fresh notebook. He looked up as Miss Marple approached, his lean face registering surprise, then wariness. "Miss Marple, isn't it?" he said, his voice clipped but polite. "What brings you here?" "I found this at the manor," she said, producing his notebook with a gentle smile. "You left it by the sale room, I believe. Your sketches are quite remarkable. Are you an artist, Mr. Gray?" He took the notebook, his fingers brushing the cover as if to confirm its return. "Not an artist, no. An art historian, as I told the staff. I'm researching 17th century portraiture, and the Ashford painting was a fine example. I was disappointed to hear it was stolen." His eyes, sharp and gray as his name, met hers briefly before dropping to the table. Miss Marple settled into a chair opposite him, her knitting resumed as a pretext for lingering. "It's a curious theft, isn't it? Such a large painting, gone in a moment. Your sketches suggest you studied it closely. Did you notice anything unusual about it today?" Gray's pen paused, and he leaned back, his expression guarded. "Only its craftsmanship. The frame had some unusual carvings, possibly a family crest, though I couldn't confirm it. I was sketching to compare it with other works of the period. When the sherry spilled, I was on the other side of the room, looking at a set of candlesticks. I left soon after, as the sale was in chaos." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking rhythmically. "You've an eye for detail, Mr. Gray. I heard you were asking about the manor's passages. For your book, I presume?" His face tightened, but he recovered quickly. "Yes, exactly. Old houses like Ashford Manor often have hidden passages, servants' routes, secret rooms. They're a fascination of mine, historically speaking. I asked the footman, Tom, about them, but he knew little." He smiled thinly, as if to dismiss the topic, but Miss Marple caught the slight tremor in his hand as he reached for his tea. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a visiting scholar had pilfered a rare book from the vicarage, claiming it was for research. Gray's interest in the manor's layout, coupled with his swift departure, suggested more than academic curiosity. "It's a pity you left so quickly," she said lightly. "You might have seen something useful. Did you notice anyone near the portrait before the spill? Mr. Ashford, perhaps, or Mrs. Winthrop?" Gray shook his head, his eyes on his notebook. "No one stood out. The room was a crush of people. I was focused on my sketches." He closed the notebook abruptly, as if signaling the end of the conversation. Miss Marple rose, her smile unwavering. "Well, I'm glad to return your notebook, Mr. Gray. If you recall anything else, do let Constable Slack know. He's quite determined to solve this." She left the parlor, her mind buzzing with new threads. Gray's sketches, his questions about passages, and his map with its attic notation pointed to premeditation, but whether he was thief or opportunist remained unclear. The clasp he'd noted on the frame intrigued her. Could it relate to the rumored map, or was it merely an artistic detail? Back at the manor, Miss Marple lingered in the hall, where the empty easel stood like a ghost. The tapestry concealing the panel caught her eye again, and she pressed it gently, confirming its resistance. Gray's interest in passages suggested he knew of such routes, but so might Edward, with his intimate knowledge of the manor, or even Mrs. Winthrop, whose maid had been suspiciously attentive. As the stars emerged over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple tucked her knitting away, her thoughts weaving a net around the elusive Mr. Gray, whose curiosity, she sensed, held a key to the portrait's fate. Chapter 6. The Manor's Secrets. The evening had settled over Ashford Manor like a velvet curtain, the last rays of daylight fading into a cool, starry night. Inside, the grand hall, once alive with the clamor of the estate sale, now stood silent, its scattered chairs and abandoned catalogues lending it the air of a stage after the players had departed. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl drawn close against the chill, lingered in the Manor's library, where the scent of old books mingled with the faint tang of wax polish. The theft of the Ashford family portrait had stirred her curiosity to a fine pitch, and she felt the Manor itself might hold clues overlooked in the day's chaos. Her thoughts kept circling back to the concealed panel she had noticed behind the easel, a subtle anomaly that whispered of secrets older than the theft itself. Mrs. Bates, the housekeeper, had invited Miss Marple to stay for a late tea, a gesture born of long acquaintance and perhaps a hope that the village's keenest observer might shed light on the mystery. The two women sat in a small parlor off the main corridor, a cozy room with faded chintz curtains and a fire crackling in the grate. The tea was strong, the scones warm, and Mrs. Bates's lined face bore the weight of a day spent managing both the sale and its aftermath. Miss Marple, her knitting needles clicking softly, steered the conversation gently toward the Manor's history. "It's such a grand old house, Mrs. Bates," she said, her voice warm with interest. "I imagine it's full of stories. That panel in the sale room, behind the tapestry. Does it lead anywhere? So many old manors have such passages, don't they?" Mrs. Bates paused, her teacup halfway to her lips, a flicker of unease crossing her face. "You've a sharp eye, Miss Marple," she said, setting the cup down. "That panel's part of an old servant's passage, used in the old days to move about without disturbing the family. It runs from the hall to the west wing, with a stair to the attic, but it's been locked for years. Sir Henry had no use for it, and the key's long lost. I haven't thought of it in ages." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of mild curiosity, though her mind seized on the detail. A locked passage to the attic, near the very spot where the portrait had vanished, was no small matter. "And no one's used it recently?" she asked, her tone as innocent as a child's. "With all the comings and goings today, perhaps someone stumbled upon it?" Mrs. Bates shook her head, her hands smoothing her apron in a familiar gesture. "Not that I know of, miss. The staff use the main corridors now, and the attic's just for storage. Old furniture, trunks, that sort of thing. But—" She hesitated, her voice dropping. "There's a story about that portrait, you know. Sir Henry used to say it hid something, a map or some such, to a treasure his great-grandfather buried during the Civil War. I never believed it myself, but folks talk." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. "How fascinating. Village gossip does love a treasure, doesn't it? Did Sir Henry ever mention where this map might be hidden?" "No, miss," Mrs. Bates replied, pouring more tea. "He'd laugh it off, call it a family fancy. But he loved that portrait, kept it in the hall even when the debts piled up. Young Mr. Edward was the same, always staring at it, like it held his heart." This aligned with Miss Marple's observations of Edward Ashford, whose attachment to the painting seemed rooted in his mother's memory. But the mention of a map, however fanciful, added a new layer to the mystery. She thanked Mrs. Bates and, claiming a need to stretch her legs, requested permission to revisit the sale room. "Just to have a look, Mrs. Bates," she said. "My nephew Raymond says I'm hopeless with auctions, but I do like to picture things as they were." Mrs. Bates, accustomed to Miss Marple's gentle eccentricities, agreed, and soon Miss Marple stood alone in the darkened hall, her torch casting a narrow beam across the oak-paneled walls. The easel, still empty, stood like a sentinel, its velvet drape now folded neatly on a nearby table. She approached the tapestry she had noticed earlier, its faded threads depicting a hunting scene. Lifting it carefully, she examined the panel beneath. A seamless fit in the wall, but for the hairline crack she'd spotted before. The dust on the floor was disturbed, not in a broad sweep, but in a narrow track, as if something heavy had been slid through a small opening. She pressed the panel gently, but it held fast, confirming Mrs. Bates's claim of a lock. Kneeling, her joints creaking softly, Miss Marple peered at the floor. The faint scent of linseed oil lingered, a trace she associated with the portrait's aged canvas. A single blue thread, caught in a splinter of the panel's edge, caught her eye. It was fine wool, the color of Edward Ashford's coat, though she cautioned herself against haste. Such threads were common enough. Still, the passage's proximity to the easel and its attic access suggested a route by which the portrait could have been spirited away, unseen by the crowd. Miss Marple straightened, her torch sweeping the room. The other exits, a main door to the corridor and a window to the garden, were too public for a thief to use unnoticed during the sale's bustle. The passage, however, offered secrecy, provided one had the key or the skill to bypass the lock. She recalled Mr. Gray's inquiries about the Manor's passages, noted in his sketches, and wondered if his historical interest masked a more practical aim. Yet Edward, with his intimate knowledge of the Manor, or even Mrs. Winthrop's maid, Elsie, who had been near the hall, could have known of such a route. Stepping back, Miss Marple considered the Manor's layout. The west wing, where the passage led, housed guest rooms and storage areas, with the attic above. She resolved to explore further, but not tonight. The Manor was too quiet, and her presence might draw suspicion. Instead, she returned to the parlor, where Mrs. Bates was tidying the tea tray. "Such a splendid room, this hall," Miss Marple said, her tone light. "I noticed the tapestry near the easel. Quite old, isn't it? Has it always hung there?" Mrs. Bates nodded, stacking cups. "Oh, yes, miss. It's been there since Sir Henry's father's time. Covers that old panel, which no one uses. I keep meaning to have it cleaned, but there's always so much to do." "And the attic?" Miss Marple asked, as if it were an afterthought. "Is it much used these days?" "Hardly ever," Mrs. Bates said. "It's full of junk, old portraits, broken chairs. Mr. Edward goes up sometimes, looking through his uncle's things, but not lately. The stairs are steep, and the doors kept locked to keep the maids from poking about." Miss Marple thanked her and took her leave, stepping into the night air. The Manor loomed behind her, its windows glowing like watchful eyes. The passage, the attic, the blue thread. These were threads in a tapestry of their own, one she was beginning to weave. Edward's attachment, Gray's sketches, and the possibility of a hidden map pointed to motives both sentimental and sinister. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a stolen locket was found in a vicarage attic, hidden by a parishioner who believed it held a secret code. The Manor's secrets, she sensed, were similarly tucked away, waiting for her patient hand to unravel them. As she walked toward her cottage, the stars bright above, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the next day. She would seek out Tom, the footman, to confirm Gray's questions about the passages, and perhaps revisit Edward, whose garden alibi grew shakier with each new clue. The manor, with its hidden ways and whispered legends, held the key to the portrait's fate, and Miss Marple, with her quiet persistence, was determined to find it. Chapter 7. Shadows of Doubt. The morning sun rose over St. Mary Mead, bathing Ashford Manor in a pale, misty light that softened its austere lines. The village was abuzz with talk of the stolen portrait, and the manor's gates, usually quiet, saw a steady trickle of curious onlookers hoping for news. Inside, the grand hall felt hollow, its remaining treasures overshadowed by the empty easel that had once held the Ashford family portrait. Miss Jane Marple, seated in a corner of the manor's morning room, her knitting needles moving with their familiar rhythm, observed the gathering of suspects with a quiet intensity. Constable Slack, his face flushed with the effort of maintaining order, had summoned Mr. Thorne, Mrs. Winthrop, Edward Ashford, and a reluctant Mr. Gray for further questioning, determined to crack the case before luncheon. The morning room, with its chintz armchairs and windows overlooking the dew-kissed lawns, was a less formal setting than the hall, but the air was thick with tension. Mr. Thorne stood by a bookcase, his wiry frame twitching as he adjusted his cufflinks, their silver spirals glinting in the light. Mrs. Winthrop, poised near a tea table, sipped from a delicate cup, her emerald dress replaced by a severe navy ensemble that did little to soften her imperious air. Edward Ashford leaned against a windowsill, his dark eyes fixed on the garden beyond, his gardening notebook conspicuously absent. Mr. Gray, retrieved from the Blue Boar after some persuasion, sat stiffly in a corner, his tweed jacket as rumpled as his composure. Miss Marple, unnoticed by the others, let her knitting serve as a shield, her ears attuned to every word and gesture. Constable Slack paced the room, his notebook open, his voice booming with authority. "Right then," he began, fixing each suspect with a stern glare. "The portrait's gone, and someone in this room knows more than they're letting on. I've got statements from half the village, and they're all useless. Nobody saw nothing, or so they claim. But paintings don't walk off on their own. Who's going to speak up?" Miss Marple, her needles clicking softly, noted the reactions. Thorne's cufflink habit intensified, his fingers tugging as if to steady his nerves. Mrs. Winthrop's lips tightened, her teacup clinking faintly against its saucer. Edward's jaw clenched, but he remained silent, his gaze unwavering. Gray shifted in his chair, his eyes darting to the door as if plotting an escape. Slack's bluster, she knew, would yield little. People guarded their secrets more fiercely under pressure. Her own approach, gentle as a summer breeze, was far more likely to coax the truth. She turned her attention to Thorne, whose nervous energy seemed to fill the room. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice mild, "you mentioned the sherry spill distracted you at the critical moment. Did you notice anyone lingering near the easel just before? Perhaps someone who seemed out of place?" Thorne blinked, caught off guard by her question. Well, it was all so hectic, Miss Marple. I was calling bids on the candelabra. Mrs. Winthrop was in a fierce tussle with two villagers. I saw Mr. Ashford by the window, sulking as usual, and Mr. Gray was scribbling in that notebook of his, but no one was right by the easel. Then the sherry glass broke, and I turned away for just a moment. His cufflinks clicked as he tugged them, and Miss Marple noted a faint tremor in his voice, as if he feared saying too much. Slack pounced on this, his pencil poised. A moment, you say? Long enough for someone to nick a 4-foot painting? Come now, Thorn. You're the auctioneer. Your eyes should have been everywhere. Thorn bristled, his face reddening. I'm not a watchman, Constable. I was managing a sale, not guarding a vault. The portrait was there, then it wasn't. I've no idea how it was done. His indignation rang true, but Miss Marple caught a fleeting glance toward Mrs. Winthrop, as if gauging her reaction. She turned to the widow, her smile disarming. Mrs. Winthrop, you were bidding so spiritedly on that candelabra. Did you happen to notice anyone near the portrait during that time? Your view of the room must have been excellent. Mrs. Winthrop set her teacup down, her diamonds glinting as she folded her hands. I was rather preoccupied, Miss Marple, she said, her tone cool but polite. Those villagers drove the price up outrageously, and I was focused on securing the candelabra. I didn't see the portrait itself, but I did notice Elsie, my maid, returning from the cloakroom just before the commotion. She might have seen something, though she's terribly shy about speaking up. Miss Marple's eyes flickered with interest. Elsie, who had been so evasive when questioned, was proving a recurring thread in this mystery. How thoughtful of Elsie to fetch your shawl, she said. Did she mention anything unusual when she returned? Mrs. Winthrop shook her head a touch too quickly. Nothing at all. She's a simple girl, not one for noticing details. I'm sure she was nowhere near the easel. Her words were firm, but Miss Marple noted the way. Her fingers tightened on her teacup, a gesture as telling as Thorn's cufflinks. Slack, growing impatient, turned to Edward. And you, Mr. Ashford, still claiming you were in the garden all morning? Mrs. Bates says she saw you near the portrait earlier, before this sherry nonsense. Care to explain? Edward's face darkened, but his voice remained steady. I've told you, Constable, I was cataloging roses. Mrs. Bates must be mistaken. She's old. Her eyes aren't what they were. I only went into the hall after the theft was announced, to see what the fuss was about. His hands, shoved into his pockets, betrayed no tremor. But Miss Marple recalled the blue thread by the panel and the smudge of oil paint on his cuff, details that gnawed at her. Finally, Slack rounded on Mr. Gray, whose attempt to shrink into his chair was almost comical. And you, sir, scarpering off to the Blue Boar the moment things went pear-shaped. Those sketches of yours, mighty suspicious if you ask me. What's an art historian doing mapping the manor's passages? Gray's eyes narrowed, but he kept his tone even. I've explained, Constable. My work involves the architecture of old estates as much as their art. The passages were of academic interest, nothing more. I was examining a set of candlesticks when the sherry spilled, nowhere near the portrait. I left because the sale was in disarray, and I had no reason to stay. His fingers gripped his notebook, and Miss Marple noted a slight flush on his cheeks, a crack in his otherwise composed facade. Slack snorted, unconvinced, and continued his interrogations, but Miss Marple's mind was elsewhere, piecing together the inconsistencies. Thorn's distraction seemed too convenient, his glance at Mrs. Winthrop suggesting a shared secret, or fear. Mrs. Winthrop's alibi held, but Elsie's absence during the critical moment raised questions about her role. Edward's garden story was undermined by Mrs. Bates's testimony, and the physical clues tying him to the hall. Gray's sketches and swift departure pointed to foreknowledge, perhaps of the manor's hidden roots. Each had opportunity, but motive remained elusive. As the questioning wound down, Miss Marple slipped from the room, her knitting bag in hand. She paused by the sale room, where the tapestry still concealed the panel. The blue thread, the linseed oil scent, and the attic access lingered in her thoughts. She recalled a St. Mary Mead incident, where a stolen clock was found in a neighbor's shed, hidden by a man whose alibi was as solid as Edward's, until his wife's nervous glance betrayed him. Doubt, she knew, cast long shadows, and in those shadows lay the truth. She resolved to speak with Elsie again, away from Mrs. Winthrop's watchful eye, and to press Tom, the footman, about Gray's questions on the passages. The Manor's secrets were beginning to surface, and Miss Marple, with her patient, unyielding curiosity, felt the pattern of the theft taking shape, its threads woven from the doubts and desires of those in the room. Chapter 8. The Hidden Passage. The moon hung low over Ashford Manor, casting a silver sheen across its weathered stones, as Miss Jane Marple made her way back to the estate under the pretense of retrieving a forgotten handkerchief. The village of St. Mary Mead had settled into its nightly quiet, but the manor, with its looming silhouette, seemed to pulse with secrets yet untold. The theft of the Ashford family portrait had stirred Miss Marple's instincts to a fine edge, and the concealed panel in the sale room, with its disturbed dust and telltale blue thread, beckoned her like a half-read page in a book. She carried her knitting bag, its weight a comforting pretext, though her torch, tucked discreetly inside, was her true companion for this nocturnal errand. The manor's side entrance, used by the staff, was unlocked, as Mrs. Bates had mentioned the servants were still tidying after the chaotic sale. Miss Marple slipped inside, her steps soft on the polished floor, and made her way to the grand hall. The vast room, now empty save for the scattered remnants of the auction, felt cavernous in the dark, the empty easel standing like a mute witness to the day's crime. Her torch beam danced across the oak-paneled walls, settling on the tapestry that concealed the panel she had examined earlier. The hunting scene woven into the fabric seemed almost alive in the flickering light, its hounds and riders frozen in pursuit. Lifting the tapestry with care, Miss Marple ran her fingers along the panel's edge, feeling the faint crack that betrayed its purpose. The blue thread she had noticed before was still there, caught on a splinter, its hue unmistakable. A match for Edward Ashford's coat. The scent of linseed oil, faint but persistent, hung in the air, a reminder of the portrait's aged canvas. She pressed the panel again, testing its resistance, but it remained firm, locked as Mrs. Bates had claimed. Yet the disturbed dust on the floor, forming a narrow track, suggested recent use. Someone, she reasoned, had opened this panel, and not long ago. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the attic, which Mrs. Bates had described as a repository of forgotten relics, accessible via the passage. The idea of a large painting being spirited through a crowd was improbable, but a hidden route to a secluded attic was another matter. She recalled Mr. Gray's notebook, with its map and attic notation, and Edward's familiarity with the manor's nooks. Even Mrs. Winthrop's maid, Elsie, so often near the hall, might have stumbled upon the passage in her duties. The key, or a means to bypass the lock, was the missing piece. Determined to explore further, Miss Marple sought out Mrs. Bates, whom she found in the kitchen, supervising a young maid washing teacups. "Mrs. Bates," she said, her voice warm with apology. "I'm so sorry to trouble you at this hour. I seem to have left my handkerchief in the sale room, and I thought I might have a quick look." Might you have a key to that old panel? I noticed it earlier, and it's such a curious feature. Mrs. Bates, her face etched with fatigue, frowned slightly. The panel, Miss Marple? I told you, the key's been lost for years. Sir Henry never bothered with it, and the attic's not worth the climb, dusty and full of junk. But if you've lost something, I can fetch Tom to help you look in the hall. No need to trouble Tom, Miss Marple said quickly, her smile disarming. I'll just have a peek myself, if you don't mind. These old houses are so fascinating, aren't they? All those hidden corners. Mrs. Bates, too weary to question further, nodded and returned to her tasks. Miss Marple made her way back to the hall, her torch illuminating the panel once more. She examined the lock, a small rusted affair set into the wood, barely visible in the dim light. It was old, likely easily picked by someone with skill, or perhaps forced, though she saw no signs of tampering. Kneeling, she swept her torch across the floor, noting the track of disturbed dust leading toward the panel's base. A faint scuff mark, not unlike the one she'd seen near the easel, caught her eye, and beside it, another fleck of gold paint, glinting like a tiny star. The portrait's gilded frame, she was certain, had left its mark here. Rising, Miss Marple considered her options. Forcing the panel was out of the question. Her strength was no match for aged oak, and she had no wish to draw attention. Instead, she traced the passage's likely path, recalling the manor's layout. Mrs. Bates had said it led to the west wing and the attic, areas less frequented during the sale. She moved quietly down the corridor, her torch guiding her to a narrow staircase tucked behind a faded curtain. The stairs, steep and creaking, led upward, their treads worn smooth by centuries of unseen feet. At the top, a locked door barred her way, its handle cold and unyielding. Miss Marple paused, her breath steady despite the climb. The attic, if Mrs. Bates was correct, was a warren of discarded relics, perhaps the perfect hiding place for a stolen painting. She tested the door, but it held fast, and without a key, further exploration was impossible. Yet the faint scent of linseed oil lingered here too, stronger than in the hall, as if the portrait had passed this way. She made a mental note to ask Tom, the footman, about the attic key, for he seemed the sort to notice details others missed. Descending carefully, Miss Marple returned to the hall, her mind weaving the clues into a tentative pattern. The panel, the thread, the gold fleck, and the attic access pointed to a deliberate act, not a spur-of-the-moment theft. Edward's presence near the easel, his sentimental attachment to the portrait, made him a likely candidate. Yet Mr. Gray's sketches and inquiries about passages suggested a calculated interest. Elsie, too, remained a question mark. Her nervousness and proximity to the hall could imply complicity, perhaps at Mrs. Winthrop's behest. Miss Marple recalled a St. Mary Mead case, where a stolen silver tray was found in a gardener's shed, hidden by a servant who knew the house's backways. The manor's passage, she sensed, was the key to unlocking this mystery. As she prepared to leave, a soft noise, a creak like a footstep, came from the corridor. Her torch snapped off, and she stood still, her heart steady but alert. The sound did not repeat, but the silence that followed felt charged, as if the manor itself were holding its breath. Miss Marple slipped out through the side entrance, her thoughts racing. Someone else, perhaps, was curious about the passage or guarding its secrets. She resolved to return in daylight, with Constable Slack's permission, to press for access to the attic. For now, The hidden passage remained a locked door in her mind, but Miss Marple, with her quiet persistence, knew that even the sturdiest locks yielded to the right key. Chapter 9. The Heir's Confession. The morning mist clung to the gardens of Ashford Manor, softening the edges of the rose beds where Miss Jane Marple found herself once more, her knitting bag a familiar weight at her side. The village of St. Mary Mead buzzed with fresh gossip about the stolen Ashford family portrait, but the manor itself was quieter now, its sale concluded, and its halls left to the echoes of yesterday's chaos. Miss Marple, however, was undeterred, her mind as sharp as the thorns she carefully avoided while strolling the gravel paths. The clues she had gathered, the blue thread, the gold fleck, the hidden passage, pointed increasingly toward Edward Ashford, the brooding heir whose attachment to the portrait seemed to run deeper than sentiment. She resolved to speak with him again, this time with the gentle persistence that had unraveled many a village secret. Edward was in the garden, as she had hoped, kneeling beside a cluster of late-blooming roses, his hands busy with a pair of pruning shears. His dark coat, the same one she had seen smudged with oil paint, was draped over a nearby bench, and his shirt sleeves were rolled up, revealing forearms dusted with earth. The sight of him, so absorbed in his task, reminded Miss Marple of a young man in St. Mary Mead who had tended his mother's garden to avoid facing a family scandal. Edward's face, when he looked up at her approach, was guarded, his eyes shadowed with something akin to resignation. "Good morning, Mr. Ashford," Miss Marple said, her voice as warm as the weak sunlight filtering through the mist. "Your roses are quite splendid. I see why you spend so much time here. It must be a solace with all that's happened." Edward rose, brushing soil from his hands, and offered a tight smile. "It's quiet out here, Miss Marple. The manor's too full of strangers these days. I'd rather be with the plants. They don't ask questions." His tone was polite, but edged with weariness, as if he sensed her purpose. Miss Marple settled onto the bench, her knitting needles emerging from her bag with their familiar click. "I quite understand," she said, "though I fear I must ask a few questions myself. The portrait's disappearance has upset everyone, and I couldn't help noticing how much it means to you. Your mother's likeness, you said. It must be painful to think of it lost." Edward's jaw tightened, and he turned to the roses, snipping a wilted bloom with unnecessary force. "Painful. Yes. It's the last piece of her I have. The idea of it being sold to some collector, hung in a stranger's house." He paused, his shears still, and Miss Marple saw a flicker of anguish cross his face. "But I told Constable Slack. I was here in the garden when it was taken. I had no part in it." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of gentle sympathy. "Of course, you've said so. And yet Mrs. Bates mentioned seeing you near the easel earlier that morning, and I found a curious thing, a blue thread, like the one from your coat, caught near a hidden panel in the sale room. It's odd, isn't it, how such small things can catch one's eye?" Edward froze, the shears slipping from his hand to the grass. His face paled, and for a moment he seemed poised to flee, but Miss Marple's steady gaze held him in place. "A thread?" he said, his voice hoarse. "There are dozens of blue coats in the village, Miss Marple. It could belong to anyone." "Perhaps," she said, her needles pausing as she met his eyes. But there was also a trace of gold paint, like that on the portrait's frame, near the panel, and on a path from the greenhouse to the manor. And the passage, Mr. Ashford, it leads to the attic, a place you know well, I'm sure, from your time exploring this house. If you know something about the portrait, it would be best to speak now. Secrets have a way of coming to light." Edward's shoulders slumped, and he sank onto the bench beside her, his hands clasped tightly. The garden was silent save for the distant call of a blackbird, and Miss Marple waited, her patience as unyielding as the manor's ancient stones. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I couldn't let it go, Miss Marple. The portrait, it's all I have left of my mother. She died when I was 10, and that painting, her face, her smile, it's the only way I can still see her. When I heard it was to be sold, I begged the solicitor to keep it, but the debts, they wouldn't listen." He paused, his eyes fixed on the roses, and Miss Marple remained silent, knowing the truth was close. "That morning," he continued, "I was in the hall, just looking at it one last time. I didn't plan anything, not at first, but when the sherry spilled and everyone was distracted, I saw my chance. The panel, I knew about it from boyhood games, hiding in the passages. It wasn't locked, not really. The catch is old, easy to jiggle open. I slid the portrait through, took it to the attic. It's there now, hidden under a tarp. I couldn't bear to lose her." Miss Marple's heart softened, though her mind remained clear. "You acted out of love, Mr. Ashford," she said gently. "But hiding it was a mistake. The portrait belongs to the estate, and others are suffering for its loss. What of this talk of a map? Did that play a part?" Edward shook his head, his expression earnest. "The map? It's a family story, nothing more. My uncle used to tease about it, said it was just a legend to make the portrait seem grander. I didn't take it for that. I took it for her." His voice broke, and he looked away, his hands trembling. Miss Marple believed him, for his anguish was as raw as any she had seen in St. Mary Mead, where a young girl once hid her mother's locket to keep it from a pawnbroker. Yet she pressed gently, testing the edges of his confession. "And no one helped you? Mrs. Winthrop's maid, Elsie, was near the hall. Did she see you, perhaps?" Edward's eyes widened. "Elsie? No, I was alone. I didn't see her or anyone near the panel. I was quick, 2 minutes, maybe less. I swear, Miss Marple, it was just me." She nodded, her knitting resumed, though her thoughts were elsewhere. Edward's confession explained the thread, the gold fleck, and the passage's use, but it left questions unanswered. Mr. Gray's sketches and inquiries about the manor's passages suggested he, too, had an interest in the portrait's fate, and Elsie's nervousness, coupled with Mrs. Winthrop's keen desire for the painting, hinted at other currents beneath the surface. Could Edward's act have been observed, or even prompted, by another? "You've been honest, Mr. Ashford," Miss Marple said, her tone kind but firm. "I'll speak to Constable Slack, but you must tell him yourself. The portrait must be returned, and the truth will ease the burden on everyone. Will you do that?" Edward nodded, his face a mixture of relief and dread. "I will. I didn't mean to cause such trouble. I only wanted to keep her with me." Miss Marple rose, her shawl adjusted with care. "I understand, my dear, but families are more than paintings. They live in our hearts, not on canvas." She left him in the garden, his head bowed, and made her way back to the manor, her mind turning over the confession. Edward's motive was clear, but the shadows of doubt lingered. Gray's curiosity, Elsie's unease, and the faint possibility of a map that might have drawn other eyes. She resolved to confront these threads next, for the portrait's hiding place was only half the mystery, and Miss Marple knew the full truth lay just beyond her grasp. Chapter 10. The Auctioneer's Deception. The midday sun filtered through the tall windows of Ashford Manor's morning room, casting dappled patterns on the faded Persian rug where Miss Jane Marple sat, her knitting needles moving with their customary precision. The air was thick with the scent of beeswax and old wood, but the atmosphere was heavier still, charged with the unresolved tension of the stolen portrait. Edward Ashford's confession in the rose garden had illuminated one thread of the mystery, but Miss Marple's keen mind, honed by years of untangling St. Mary Mead's secrets, sensed that other strands remained knotted. Her thoughts turned to Mr. Reginald Thorne, the auctioneer, whose nervous tics and theatrical distress had caught her attention from the start. His role as overseer of the sale made him a pivotal figure, and she resolved to probe deeper into his account. Constable Slack, still bustling with more zeal than insight, had gathered the suspects again in the morning room, his notebook now a tattered testament to his dogged efforts. Mr. Thorne stood near the fireplace, his wiry frame taut as he adjusted his silver cufflinks, their spiral engravings glinting like tiny beacons. Mrs. Clara Winthrop, seated with her usual poise, sipped tea with an air of detached amusement, her navy dress as impeccable as her alibi. Edward Ashford, pale but composed after his confession, lingered by a window, his eyes fixed on the garden as if seeking solace in its familiarity. Mr. Lionel Gray, summoned once more from the Blue Boar, sat with his notebook clutched tightly, his face a mask of guarded irritation. Miss Marple, unobtrusive in her corner, let her knitting serve as a cloak for her observations, her ears attuned to every nuance. Slack, his voice booming, addressed the group. "Right, we're getting somewhere at last. Young Ashford's admitted to hiding the portrait, but I'm not convinced he acted alone. Someone else in this room might have had a hand in it, or an eye on it. Speak up now, or I'll have the manor searched top to bottom." His threat, though earnest, lacked the subtlety Miss Marple knew was needed to coax truth from such a varied cast. She turned her gentle gaze to Mr. Thorne, whose cufflink habit had grown more pronounced under Slack's scrutiny. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice soft as a summer breeze, "you've had such a trying time, managing this sale and now this theft. I couldn't help noticing how carefully you keep your ledger. It must be a great responsibility. Did you record anything unusual about the portrait's listing? Perhaps a late bid that didn't make it to the auction?" Thorne's fingers froze on his cufflinks, and a flush crept up his neck. "Unusual? No, Miss Marple, nothing of the sort. The portrait was listed, but no bids were placed before it vanished. I checked the ledger myself. It's all in order." His words came quickly, too quickly, and Miss Marple noted the way his eyes darted to the floor, avoiding her steady gaze. She smiled, her needles clicking rhythmically. "How curious. I thought I heard mention of a late bid, perhaps from an anonymous buyer. It's easy to miss such things in the bustle, isn't it? My nephew Raymond once forgot a whole page of his manuscript because he was distracted by a noisy tea party." Thorne's flush deepened, and he tugged at his cufflinks so sharply one popped loose, clattering to the rug. He stooped to retrieve it, his movements jerky. "A late bid? You're mistaken, Miss Marple. The portrait drew interest, yes, but no formal bids. I'd have recorded it if there were. The sherry spill threw everything into chaos, you see." His voice carried a defensive edge, and Miss Marple, who had seen similar deflections in a St. Mary mead. Shopkeeper caught fudging his accounts, sensed a crack in his facade. Constable Slack, seizing the moment, loomed over Thorne. Chaos, eh? Convenient for a thief, that spill. You were supposed to be watching the lots, Thorne. Are you saying you let a priceless painting slip away because of a bit of sherry? Thorne bristled, his wiry frame straightening. I'm no thief, Constable. I've run auctions from London to Bristol and never lost a thing. This is a calamity, a stain on my name. I was distracted, yes, but only for a moment. The portrait was gone when I turned back. No one could have moved it without being seen. His indignation was fierce, but Miss Marple caught a fleeting glance toward Mrs. Winthrop, as if seeking her reaction. She turned to the widow, her tone mild. Mrs. Winthrop, you were so active in the bidding. Did you notice Mr. Thorne speaking with anyone about the portrait before the spill? Perhaps someone inquiring about its value? Mrs. Winthrop set her teacup down, her diamonds catching the light. I was far too busy with that candelabra, Miss Marple. Mr. Thorne was at his podium, calling bids as usual. I didn't see him with anyone in particular, though I recall him fussing with his ledger before the chaos started. Her voice was smooth, but Miss Marple noted a slight tightening of her lips, as if she, too, sensed Thorne's unease. Returning to Thorne, Miss Marple pressed gently, her voice as soothing as a lullaby. Your ledger must be a treasure trove of details, Mr. Thorne. I wonder, did you ever discuss the portrait's value with an outside buyer? Someone who might have wanted it kept off the auction block? Thorne's face paled, and his cufflink habit ceased abruptly, his hands dropping to his sides. The room seemed to hold its breath, even Slack pausing his bluster to watch. An outside buyer? Thorne said, his voice barely audible. I may have had inquiries, you know, as auctioneers do. A gentleman from London, a collector, asked about the portrait a week ago. I told him it was to be auctioned, but he suggested, a private sale, at a lower price. I refused, of course. My reputation depends on fairness. His words tumbled out, and Miss Marple saw the truth in his eyes. Not guilt for the theft, but shame for a scheme undone. She leaned forward, her needles still. And this collector, did he press you further? Perhaps offer a sum that tempted you to undervalue the portrait in the sale? Thorne's shoulders sagged, and he sank into a chair, his bravado gone. He did, he admitted, his voice low. He offered a tidy sum to keep the bidding low, so he could snap it up cheap. I thought I could manage it, make a bit extra without anyone knowing. But then the portrait was stolen, and the whole plan fell apart. I swear, Miss Marple, I didn't take it. I was as shocked as anyone when it vanished. Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of quiet understanding. Thorne's confession, though not of theft, revealed a greed that clouded his judgment. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead grocer, who had inflated prices for a wealthy buyer, only to be caught when a ledger entry betrayed him. Thorne's scheme explained his nervousness, his glances at Mrs. Winthrop, who might have suspected his dealings. But it did not explain the portrait's disappearance. Edward's act, it seemed, had preempted Thorne's plan. Slack, sensing a breakthrough, pounced. So you were scheming to cheat the estate, were you? That's motive enough for theft, Thorne. Where's that ledger? I want to see it. Thorne produced the ledger from his satchel, its pages creased and ink-stained. Slack flipped through it, muttering. But Miss Marple's eyes were on Thorne's face, now a mask of defeat. The ledger, she suspected, would show no bids for the portrait, corroborating Edward's swift action. Thorne's deception, while unsavory, seemed separate from the theft itself, a parallel thread in the manor's tangled web. As Slack continued his interrogation, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the remaining suspects. Edward's confession had clarified the portrait's hiding place, but Gray's sketches and Elsie's nervousness suggested other motives at play. Thorne's greed had muddied the waters, but it did not account for the passage's use or the attic's role. She resolved to press Elsie next, for the maid's evasions hinted at knowledge, perhaps of Edward's act or something more. The morning room, with its tense occupants, felt like a stage where the final act was yet to unfold, and Miss Marple, with her patient clarity, knew the truth was close at hand. Chapter 11. The Buyer's Gambit. The afternoon light streamed through the morning room's windows at Ashford Manor, casting long golden bars across the worn rug where Miss Jane Marple sat, her knitting needles moving with their quiet, relentless rhythm. The air was thick with the scent of tea and tension, as the aftermath of Mr. Thorne's confession lingered like a storm's last rumble. Edward Ashford's admission of hiding the portrait had solved one piece of the puzzle, but Miss Marple's sharp mind, honed by years of unraveling St. Mary Mead's intrigues, sensed that other threads remained loose. Her attention now turned to Mrs. Clara Winthrop, the wealthy widow whose desire for the portrait had been as evident as her diamonds, and whose maid, Elsie, had displayed nervousness that piqued Miss Marple's curiosity. Constable Slack, his energy undimmed despite the case's complexities, was pacing the room, his notebook now a crumpled testament to his relentless questioning. Mr. Thorne, still shaken from his admission of scheming with a private buyer, stood by the fireplace, his cufflinks mercifully still. Edward Ashford, his confession weighing heavily, remained by the window, his face a mask of quiet resolve. Mr. Gray, clutching his notebook, like a shield, sat with a wary expression, his earlier composure fraying at the edges. Mrs. Winthrop, however, commanded the room's center, her navy dress as crisp as her demeanor, sipping tea with an air of unruffled elegance. Elsie hovered nearby, her hands twisting in her apron, her eyes darting between her mistress and the floor. Miss Marple, her shawl adjusted with care, seized a moment of calm to address Mrs. Winthrop. "Mrs. Winthrop," she said, her voice gentle as a summer breeze, "you've been so patient through all this fuss. I couldn't help noticing how much you admired the portrait. It would have been a fine addition to your collection. Did you ever learn anything more about it, perhaps from Elsie, who seems so attentive?" Mrs. Winthrop's teacup paused midway to her lips, and she offered a polished smile. "You're very kind to say so, Miss Marple. Yes, the portrait was exquisite, a perfect match for my gallery at Winthrop Lodge. I knew of its rumored history. Of course, the talk of a hidden map, but I wanted it for its artistry, not some fanciful treasure. Elsie? She's far too busy with my errands to bother with such things." Her tone was smooth, but Miss Marple noted a slight tightening of her fingers on the cup, a gesture as telling as Thorne's cufflinks. She turned her gaze to Elsie, who stood frozen, her cheeks flushing under scrutiny. "Elsie, dear," Miss Marple said, her voice warm and inviting. "You were in and out of the hall during the sale, weren't you? It must have been so hectic with all those people. Did you happen to see anyone near the portrait before the sherry spill? Mr. Ashford, perhaps, or Mr. Gray?" Elsie's hands twisted harder in her apron, and she glanced at Mrs. Winthrop, as if seeking permission to speak. I was fetching the mistress's shawl, like she said, miss, she stammered. I didn't see nothing near the easel. It was all a blur, folks everywhere. Her words came too quickly, and Miss Marple, who had seen such nervousness in a St. Mary Mead maid who hid a stolen brooch for her employer, knew Elsie was holding back. Constable Slack, sensing weakness, rounded on the maid. "Come now, girl, out with it. You were skulking about the hall, weren't you? Saw something and didn't tell? I'll have you in for questioning if you don't speak up." Elsie flinched, her eyes welling with tears, and Mrs. Winthrop intervened, her voice sharp. "Constable, there's no need to bully my maid. Elsie's loyal and honest. She saw nothing, as she says. I won't have her harassed over your lack of progress." Her defense was swift, but Miss Marple caught a fleeting look of warning in her eyes, directed at Elsie, who shrank back further. Undeterred, Miss Marple leaned forward, her needles pausing. "Of course, Mrs. Winthrop, no one doubts Elsie's loyalty. But maids often hear things others miss, don't they? I recall a case in our village where a young girl overheard a conversation that solved a theft. Elsie, did you perhaps hear Mr. Ashford or anyone else mention the portrait's importance? Maybe something about its frame, or that old story of a map?" Elsie's face paled, and she hesitated, her fingers knotting the apron into a tight ball. I did hear Mr. Ashford, miss," she said at last, her voice barely audible. "Not on purpose, mind you. I was in the corridor, near the sale room, before the sherry spill. He was talking to himself, saying how he couldn't let the portrait go, how it was his mother's last memory. I didn't think much of it then. I just thought he was upset about the sale." Mrs. Winthrop's expression remained impassive, but her teacup clinked sharply against its saucer. "Elsie, you never mentioned this," she said, her tone deceptively calm. "Why bring it up now?" "I didn't think it mattered, ma'am," Elsie said, her voice trembling. "It was just talk, and then the portrait was gone, and I didn't want to cause trouble." Her eyes darted to Miss Marple, pleading for understanding. Miss Marple nodded, her smile reassuring. "You've done right to tell us, Elsie. It's often the smallest things that matter most. Did you share this with Mrs. Winthrop later, perhaps, since you knew her interest in the portrait?" Elsie shook her head vigorously. "No, miss, I swear I didn't. I told no one till now. I was just doing my duties, fetching the shawl and such." But her nervous glance toward her mistress suggested otherwise, and Miss Marple filed this away, recalling how a St. Mary Mead servant had once concealed her employer's petty theft out of misplaced loyalty. Turning to Mrs. Winthrop, Miss Marple's tone remained gentle, but probing. "It's curious, isn't it, Mrs. Winthrop? Elsie's information might have been useful earlier. You were so keen on the portrait. Did you ever ask her to keep an eye on it during the sale, perhaps to gauge its bidders?" Mrs. Winthrop's smile was a touch too bright. "Really, Miss Marple, you make it sound like a conspiracy. I asked Elsie to watch the sale, yes, as I was busy with the candelabra. I wanted to know who else was bidding, in case I needed to raise my offer. But that's hardly sinister. It's what collectors do. When the portrait vanished, I assumed some thief had outmaneuvered us all." Her words were plausible, but Miss Marple noted the careful phrasing, as if each sentence had been rehearsed. Slack, growing restless, interrupted. "Enough dancing around. Mrs. Winthrop, did you or your maid have anything to do with this theft? And don't give me that nonsense about shawls and candelabras." Mrs. Winthrop's eyes flashed, but she maintained her composure. "Constable, I've told you I was bidding with 2 witnesses when the portrait was taken. Elsie was in the cloakroom, as she said. I wanted the portrait, yes, but I don't stoop to theft. If you must accuse someone, look to Mr. Ashford. He's already admitted to hiding it." Her deflection was swift, and Edward at the window stiffened but said nothing. Miss Marple's thoughts raced. Elsie's admission confirmed Edward's motive, but Mrs. Winthrop's instructions to watch the sale suggested a deeper interest, perhaps in the portrait's rumored map. Elsie's nervousness and her failure to report Edward's words earlier hinted at pressure from her mistress, or fear of revealing something more. Miss Marple recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a lady's maid had overheard her employer plotting to acquire a rival's jewelry, only to remain silent out of loyalty. Mrs. Winthrop's gambit, it seemed, was to gather intelligence through Elsie, but whether it extended to complicity in the theft was unclear. As Slack continued his blustering questions, Miss Marple rose, her knitting tucked away. "Thank you, Elsie, for being so forthcoming," she said kindly. "And Mrs. Winthrop, your candor is most helpful. I'm sure the portrait will be found soon, thanks to Mr. Ashford's honesty." She excused herself, stepping into the corridor, her mind weaving the new information into the tapestry of the case. Mrs. Winthrop's ambition, Elsie's eavesdropping, and Edward's act formed a complex pattern, but Mr. Gray's sketches and Thorne's greed remained outliers. The portrait was in the attic, but the full truth, Miss Marple knew, was still hidden in the shadows of the manor's secrets. Chapter 12. The portrait restored. The late afternoon sun bathed Ashford Manor in a golden glow, its rays filtering through the tall windows of the grand hall, where the empty easel stood as a silent reminder of the recent turmoil. The village of St. Mary Mead, though still abuzz with gossip, had begun to settle, as if sensing the mystery of the stolen portrait was nearing its end. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag tucked under her arm, stood in the hall, her sharp eyes taking in the now familiar scene. The oak-paneled walls, the faded tapestry, the faint scuff marks on the parquet floor. Edward Ashford's confession had revealed the portrait's hiding place, and Mr. Thorne's admission of his underhanded scheme had clarified his role. But Miss Marple's meticulous mind, shaped by years of unraveling village intrigues, knew the final threads needed tying. Constable Slack, his bluster tempered by the progress made, had agreed to accompany Miss Marple to the attic, where Edward claimed the portrait was hidden. Mrs. Bates, ever loyal to the manor, provided a rusty key from a forgotten drawer, her hands trembling slightly as she handed it over. "I hope this ends it, Miss Marple," she said, her voice heavy with relief. "The manor's seen enough upset." "I'm sure it will, Mrs. Bates," Miss Marple replied, her smile gentle but resolute. Truth has a way of setting things right. With Slack and Mrs. Bates in tow, she ascended the narrow staircase to the attic, its steep treads creaking under their weight. The air grew musty as they climbed, the scent of linseed oil mingling with dust and thyme. The attic door, stiff with disuse, yielded to the key, revealing a cavernous space cluttered with the detritus of centuries, cracked mirrors, moth-eaten tapestries, and trunks bulging with forgotten finery. Miss Marple's torch swept the shadows, settling on a corner where a heavy tarpaulin lay draped over a large rectangular shape. Slack, with a grunt of triumph, pulled the covering aside, revealing the Ashford family portrait, its gilt frame gleaming faintly, its stern faces untouched by the day's drama. "There it is," he exclaimed, his notebook already out. Ashford was telling the truth, then? Miss Marple nodded, her eyes tracing the frame's intricate carvings, recalling Mr. Gray's sketches and his note about a hidden clasp. She ran a finger along the edge, feeling for irregularities, but found nothing to confirm the legend of a hidden map. "It's quite safe," she said, her voice soft. "A fine thing to see it restored." Back in the grand hall, the portrait was returned to its easel, and a small crowd gathered: Mrs. Winthrop, Mr. Thorne, Mr. Gray, and a few curious villagers. Edward Ashford stood apart, his face a mixture of relief and shame as he faced the group. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice steady but low. "I only wanted to keep it for my mother's sake. I'll accept whatever comes." Mrs. Winthrop, her expression cool but not unkind, spoke up. "It's a noble sentiment, Mr. Ashford, if poorly executed. The portrait belongs to the family, not to be hidden away. Perhaps a museum might take it, to preserve its history?" Edward nodded, his eyes on the painting. "I've thought of that. The St. Mary Mead Historical Society. They'd care for it properly. I'll arrange it, if the estate allows." Miss Marple, watching from her corner, approved of the solution, which echoed a St. Mary Mead case where a stolen heirloom was donated to the village church after its recovery. She turned to Mr. Gray, whose presence had been so enigmatic. "Mr. Gray," she said, her tone mild, "your sketches were most detailed. I trust your research will benefit from seeing the portrait safe?" Gray, his notebook tucked away, offered a sheepish smile. "Indeed, Miss Marple. I got carried away with my studies, thought the frame might hold some historical clue, but it seems I was chasing shadows. I'm just glad it's back." His admission, though vague, confirmed Miss Marple's suspicion that his interest was academic, not criminal, his sketches a scholar's zeal rather than a thief's plan. Mr. Thorne, his reputation bruised but intact, cleared his throat. "I'll ensure the sales proceeds are handled properly," he said, his cufflinks mercifully still. "No more private deals, I assure you." His chastened tone satisfied Miss Marple, who knew greed often needed only exposure to be curbed. Constable Slack, eager to close the case, declared no charges would be pressed, given the portrait's recovery and Edward's cooperation. "But don't try it again, Ashford," he warned, his mustache twitching. "And you, Thorne, keep your auctions honest." As the group dispersed, Miss Marple lingered, her knitting resumed. Mrs. Winthrop approached, her diamonds glinting. "You've a sharp mind, Miss Marple," she said, a hint of admiration in her voice. "I confess, I had Elsie watch the sale closely, hoping to learn who wanted the portrait. But theft? Never my style." Miss Marple smiled, her needles clicking. "I never doubted you, Mrs. Winthrop. Collectors are passionate, but passion needn't lead to crime." She knew Elsie's eavesdropping had been at her mistress's behest, but with the portrait restored, there was no need to press the maid further. As she left the manor, the evening air cool and crisp, Miss Marple reflected on the case. Edward's love for his mother, Thorne's greed, Gray's curiosity, and Mrs. Winthrop's ambition had woven a complex tapestry. But the truth, as always, lay in the human heart. The portrait, now destined for a museum, would carry its secrets, real or imagined, into the future. And Miss Marple, with her quiet wisdom, felt the satisfaction of a mystery resolved. Returning to her cottage, her knitting bag swinging gently, she mused on the power of family ties and how, like her stitches, they could bind or unravel with equal ease.